Hello, Emotions Companions, and this video is going to be about the sadness family. As I mentioned to you in the welcome video, the sadness family and I were quite acquainted with one another. The four members of the family are sadness, grief, situational depression, and suicidal urge, and I was uh, close companions with all of them, even though not desired. They were so heavy, and in the heaviness, there were times I just wanted to sit down on the path and not even move. Hence my not minding being hit by a bus or having my life end. Life just felt so gray. In retrospect, I believe that that wasn't really just my experience, but the experience of my family. I think we were all just swimming in that kind of environment. The coping mechanisms that I came up with to help me keep going one step, one foot in front of the other, were numbing out, doing some mild dissociation, and distracting myself with an addiction to achievement and to serving others, to crazy amounts of busyness that were very well rewarded and affirmed. And this was what helped me to just kind of deal with the whole mess and kind of keep putting one foot in front of the other. With very little or no help with my emotions, I also developed a hypervigilance to any kind of sadness or loss. And I could feel this uh-oh arise in me when even a little bit more kind of seeped in. And I would just add a little more numbness or distract myself more so that the grayness would not deepen with what felt like it would just go on for weeks. And sometimes it did. When I first read about sadness in Language of Emotions, I read that there are two movements to sadness, that there is the loss, there's the release, but then there's also the rejuvenation or the restoration. And that was absolutely shocking because, man, that was not my experience. I got the first movement, but the second movement was like I had never experienced anything even remotely like that. And it just wasn't the way my sadness worked. And so I just figured, oh, I must be really broken. And what I discovered in the reading was that something was broken, but it wasn't my sadness. It was my sadness's relationship to my anger. And anger, was the emotion I had very little access to and was my entree into this more intentional emotions journey by God. And it has continued to be the emotion I have had to work the hardest to make space for in myself and to give myself permission to have. And it's required lots and lots of contract burning. Thank you, anger and shame, for your help. So sadness and anger's intended relationship. Sadness, again, as I mentioned in the welcome video, is a tender and vulnerable kind of space emotion. And so it needs a protected and safe place to do its vulnerable and tender work. Sadness brings change, which can feel destabilizing for a time. And when anger is not present to provide protection, to provide that kind of stability, then sadness has a hard time doing its job because it's just too exposed. It's feeling just a little too um, unstable. Anger's job is to protect and stabilize and to guide you by your values. Thank you, anger. When sadness and anger are working together, then unworkable and outworn ideas, relationships, etc., can be released and your deepest path is restored. Your deepest being able to live deeply as yourself. This will naturally bring about a sense of rejuvenation because even though you will feel pain of letting go of the unworkable, outworn ideas or relationships, you will also feel the relief of knowing you're once again on your truth path, living out of your deep center. When sadness and anger are not working together, anger without sadness will tend to protect and restore, without ever asking whether what is being protected and restored is worth keeping. Is it still needed? Is it still relevant? You will tend to keep defending an indefensible position, while some part of you is wondering why you're doing it. Sadness without anger tends to release so much that you lose parts of yourself. Without your anger's protection and values clarity, your sadness might release too much. Essential parts of yourself are lost in the torrent of release. That was me. When anger and sadness are really not working together, anger is not accessible or very accessible only a little bit, and sadness is in the lead. I want to just read you a couple of these quotes out of Language of Emotions. In a well-moderated psyche, anger is the primary emotion, the boundary center and sentry of the soul, while sadness acts in a more interior way to restore flow, grounding, and integrity. When someone growing up with raging or addicted adults, or in a rigid hierarchical community, or are survivors of other childhood traumas, they tend to drop their anger in order to get some leniency, to survive, and to continue to belong. Though this is a brilliant coping mechanism, it is not intended as a way of life. When it is, the person will often struggle with physical and emotional instability, cycling depressions and anxieties, unworkable relationships, and excruciating loneliness, even though they're usually surrounded by people. After a while, they realize they're trapped in a dreadful cycle of stabilizing unstable people and systems over and over again in an exhausting repetition of their childhood trauma. Breaking this debilitating cycle begins when they realize that leading with their survival skills rather than their emotions and their full human selves ensures that they will remain in survival mode. Wow, me. Just all of those things she described, it was like, yes, that's me. She must have been following me around and using me as her case study. But then further, when sadness and anger are even more seriously not working together, sadness and grief get stuck, and this is despair. About 1.5 years ago, I was reading this section on despair in Language of Emotions. I'd already read it quite a few times. I had already been working with the material for 2 to 3 years by then. But on that day, this paragraph hit me like a ton of bricks. When channeling despair, some form of anger, panic, depression, and grief should follow all seriously disruptive life events. When you become trapped in despair, though, these natural states cannot flow properly. Therefore, when you channel despair, you could find trapped angers that have morphed into rages, trapped depressions and griefs that may have turned into suicidal urges, or trapped panics that make you feel that life is and always will be endangering to you. Your emotions have little choice but to intensify themselves when there is a blockage. Yes, 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 this was me. I couldn't believe I hadn't ever realized this before. It was so obvious. I even went back to check that in the previous edition of the book, which is where I'd done most of my reading, that this paragraph actually had been there, and it was. Despair is a really big word, especially as a Christian where hope is a key part of our faith. It felt like it was another admission of failure. But I couldn't deny the yes, yes, yes. And so I had more emotion skills by then, and so I leaned into the God that loves me just as I am, which gave me resolve to hold on to my value, to make space for myself. Thank you, anger. And this gave me the courage to see just where I was, which was anger, which was despair. Now, despair is a learned behavior. We are not formed that way. It is not part of our natural design. It is not part of our natural design to have our sadness, our grief stuck and not move into the second movement of rejuvenation and restoration. And this formation happens in a situation like for the person described, where sadness is in the lead and there's little collaboration and partnership between sadness and anger, where anger needs to be dropped in order to survive. But with despair, not only has the person dropped their anger, but they are actually committed to it as a stance for survival. A stance is simply defined as an intentional, committed position. They see themselves as victims and focus on the ways they've been harmed. They anticipate more wrong being done to them with no power to change anything, including themselves. They experience themselves as powerless in the face of harm. There is just very little sense of agency, if any sense of agency. They agree with the abuser or the hierarchy as to their own identity, that they're powerless and they're dispensable, so it's permissible for them to be harmed. They also rarely take responsibility for their participation in the hurtful situation. There's a lot of shame that is just rampant in here as well. For example, in a relationship where this person is being diminished, assuming this is an adult-to-adult relationship, they blame the other person for their actions, which is true, but they don't acknowledge their participation in their own diminishment by allowing the behavior to continue. So there's no sense, again, of their own agency, because you need agency in order to take responsibility and to then have the power to make changes. The consequence of this is that sadness is only experienced in its first movement, the release, the loss. And the second movement, the rejuvenation, the filling, the restoration, is never experienced. Sadness and grief have been imprisoned in a feedback loop where rejuvenation cannot occur. Being able to name despair was the first step, and it has been a journey. It has continued to be a journey of recognizing how deeply embedded the despair has been because of deeply embedded cultural contracts that really kept the despair obscured, very hard to see. So this past February, so about 6 months ago, I participated in a 2-week practicum, I would call it, called Sacred River of Grief with Carla, which helped bring more grief, but also the source of the despair further to the surface. So by last February, I did have even more emotion skills. And one of the things they said about this participating in this grief practicum, this grief ritual, and that's where it kind of culminated as we participated in an online grief ritual together. That an important part of it was that we would be able to clarify our intention, to be able to name what we were mourning, that was really important to the effectiveness of the grief ritual. And, you know, the fires had just happened. It was still incredibly devastating. You know, the new administration had just been sworn in, and so there was already just a lot of fear of what he was going to do. So that was the most obvious thing to grieve, but it didn't quite settle in me. And so as I kept sitting with it, there was a day where I was in worship, and it suddenly came to me that I needed to grieve the day of my birth. I mean, I was surprised that that's what came forward, but it came forward with such clarity. A number of years before, I had a period of time in prayer where Jesus kept leading me into this hallway, and there was this closed door, and I just had a sense I needed to open the door, and it took me a while until I felt ready. Jesus, you know, wasn't forcing me, but he was simply with me. And so anyway, one day I felt ready. I opened the door, and I entered a hospital room, and that hospital room was the day of my birth. And I saw my mother, and I saw me as a newborn, and I saw her disappointed look. I was a girl, and she had been hoping, praying for a boy. And I realized when I saw that, I knew just like deep in my body that was true, and also that I had always known that. But this brought it to consciousness. And on this day in worship, just a few months back, this is what came back as needing some more work. One of the things that we did with the preparing and doing the grief rituals was just naming things that needed to die, that we needed to allow them to name them, that they had died, and that, or something had died, and to be willing to release them. And one of the things that came up as I continued to sit with this focus for my grief ritual, my mother's disappointed gaze at my birth, because I was a girl, I realized that I had actually taken in that gaze in such a deep way, and that I, for many years, have gazed at myself with disappointment, and that I needed to let die the desire, and it would have, and is God's intention, that an infant, a newborn, would be greeted with a gaze of delight by their mother. I had to let that die. This morning, I was remembering in my first centering prayer retreat about 10 years ago, where I met with a spiritual director who was also a massage therapist. And I remember in the session that these gut sobs, I mean, it was like gut-wrenching sobs for my ancestors and for all that they had suffered, just, gosh, burst out of me. And I was so surprised, because I had no idea that was even in me, and I could just feel it so viscerally. It was tangible. And I remember sobbing and sobbing and sobbing, but there was really not much relief. It was stuck. I didn't at that time have significant emotion skills, especially to deal with such intense emotion, which I had a lot of. I didn't have much access to the emotions that God had given me to deal with real loss. And so, no wonder depression and suicidal urge were such close companions. They were pointing and pointing and pointing to so much war that was in my interior. Stuck sadness and grief, despair, was just part of the war. My lack of access to my emotions in general and my body. They were also pointing to much that was outside of me that just needed to be let go of. Toxic contracts that had to be burned, relationships that had to change, situations that had to shift, behaviors that had to go, that were threatening me with soul death. Depression and suicidal urge were present because they were God's gifts to me to help me thrive. In the scriptures, one of my favorite stories around grief and sadness is the story of the raising of Lazarus. This is in John 11. So Lazarus is very, very ill. Mary and Martha send word to Jesus to come and heal him, because they have seen him heal people who are sick. He doesn't go, and Lazarus dies. And when he finally goes, Lazarus has already been in the tomb for 4 days. And when he gets there, Martha runs out first, and then Mary does. And when Mary does, she is weeping, and there's a group of people called the Jews that come with her, and they're weeping too. And Jesus weeps with Mary and the Jews at Lazarus' tomb. He doesn't stop them and say that he is about to bring Lazarus back to life. They don't need to grieve, they don't need to weep anymore. Please stop. This is it's all going to be good. Grieving is an expression of love. We only grieve over that which is precious to us. In John 11:35 and 36, it says, Jesus began to cry. And the Jews said, see how much he loved him. Jesus joins his love to their love, Mary and the Jews' love for Lazarus, declaring with them that Lazarus is precious to them and to him. I am in Los Angeles, and we are really like the epicenter of the raids on immigrants. And in the midst of all this, and I'm very connected with more than one immigrant community, I've had more awareness, more stirring of sadness and grief with my dad, who has already been dead for like 20 years. My dad was an immigrant man, and as was my mother was an immigrant as well. Last week, couple weeks ago, I went to a vigil where some immigrants had been just swept up off the streets, abducted. Had so many mixed emotions in the midst of that vigil. And as I walked away from it, as I left it, these words popped up. Don't cause trouble. My dad would tell us that as a way of being in the world. Don't cause trouble. And that's what he learned. That's how he had to function. Both, where we lived, as I mentioned, I think sometime, that we lived in a small town where we were like 25% of the population of color, and later I found out it was a hub for the Ku Klux Klan. So as an immigrant man, he was very vulnerable. Earlier in his life as an adolescent, when the Japanese invaded China, he was the provider of food for his family, and again, just very, very vulnerable. And this don't cause trouble, stay under the radar really made sense. You don't put yourself at the in the radar of enemy, Japanese or soldiers that are enemy soldiers that are killing, your community, and or people, that are part of the Ku Klux Klan, that you're clearly not part of their us. And so to honor his value of providing for his family, he really learned to stuff his anger and stuff it really deep. So he couldn't embrace his anger. I mean, this was, the situations where sadness and anger don't work together. This was, really in spades. And so his anger his sadness and grief were massively stuck. And it was really costly. Post-retirement, when there was more space in his life, this sadness and this really stuffed down anger came bubbling up in a pretty significant way. But he had no skills to work with it, and there were not people around him with a lot of skill either. I was definitely, I did not have much in the way of emotion skill at that time. And so he died without being able to really be able to embrace the success, the victory of, he did provide for his family. He did meet an important value that he had. But when you push down, sadness and grief and you can't, the happiness family doesn't just pop up. Everything is pushed down. And so he was just not able to be present to that, to his amazing courage and accomplishment. And I can mourn that loss, that death for him, his death. And I honor it. I honor what was lost by simply telling you his story and doing this work with emotions, so that there are more people that have the skills to work in a world that where there is really heartbreak and there is violation. I'm feeling my way forward on how to be involved in responding to the raids, and how that might be part of the honoring. I'm pondering what I need to do with this contract of don't cause trouble. I was offered in a group direction session another phrase, cause good trouble, which was said by John Lewis, a civil rights leader. And so I'm pondering that. Do I need to burn one contract and take on the other one? Do I need to renegotiate? I don't know, but I know I need to do something with it. And I notice that I don't feel despair. I'm feeling the flow. I'm present, and that there is more to mourn, and there is more to explore with that of an opportunity to honor. I am present to that there is much love that I can stand in with Jesus, who joins his love to mine and makes it more than enough for what has died and what must be mourned. Sadness, grief, situational depression, and suicidal urge continue to be close companions, but now as welcome companions that I know how to work with, or work with better, consciously, rather than letting the habitual response hold sway. I name the emotion when it comes forward. I thank it for its gifts. And then I ask God for help to hear what my emotion is saying. I've learned to notice the emotion at a mild or medium level. Yes, there is such a thing as mild suicidal urge. And I've learned to just check in like, would I mind being hit by a bus or not mind being hit by a bus? And that just like, at that mild level, it just gives me a clear indication, is this suicidal urge or not? And if it is suicidal urge, I ask the suicidal urge questions. of what is threatening me with soul death and is just gotta go. I bear witness to you. These emotions have my back, and that they continue to bear faithful witness, along with all the emotions, to significant parts of my sacred story that have been forgotten or dismissed as trivial at best. They have labored with God to bring all of me, my parts, my story, bring them home. And may this be true as well for you as we continue this journey with emotions.